What were the different castes of New Orleans aristocracy, Louisiana high society? Starting off to begin with, is the government officials that came over from either France or Spain. These were the governors who came from France and governed over the colony. They formed at the core the elite top tier of society in colonial Louisiana and colonial New Orleans. They're always based in New Orleans. The most aristocratic governor to ever exist in Louisiana is the Marquis de Vaudreuil, and him and his wife presided over New Orleans for 10 years as if it were Versailles. And you could kind of say that's the beginning of corruption in New Orleans and high society mannerisms in New Orleans. But so fast forward, after the governors, you had you also have a plantation society, merchants, wealthy trade people who shipped things, and they were immensely wealthy. That that formed the nucleus of colonial society in New Orleans, who was rich and wealthy, and people who had plantations. Now moving on, after the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, you have the original French, the descendants of the original French settlers and the Spanish settlers calling themselves Creoles. That was to distinguish themselves from the Americans coming in. And you also had a caste of free people of color, Creoles of color, who in many cases were mixed. Not all of them were mixed, but they were free. They had their own property. They had their own slaves. As a whole thing in itself, they also formed their own society. But you have wealthy Americans coming in. They're really intent on making business, making money, and utilizing New Orleans as a port. And they became wealthy in their own way. And they're not welcomed the French Quarter by the Creoles, so they move upriver, what we now know as the Garden District, which was then known as Lafayette. It becomes incorporated in the city of New Orleans in the 1850s. But the Americans form their own society. They're their own wealthy society. You have the Creoles, the French Creoles, and then the mixed free Creoles of color. There's like three separate societies going on here. You have plantation owners coming from up the river, from Natchez, Mississippi, all the way, Baton Rouge, down to New Orleans. People who own plantations who are very wealthy. They're part of their own aristocracy, but they constitute New Orleans society as well, because they come into New Orleans and they are buying things, and they have seats at the French Opera House. After the Civil War destroys the slave economy in the South, and especially hurting New Orleans, because New Orleans was the largest slave market in the nation. You have carpetbaggers coming into New Orleans and kind of looting the town. And General Benjamin Butler, when he came into New Orleans, he took a lot of the city's wealth with him. But in the 1880s, 1890s, 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, there still was a high society in New Orleans, not just the Americans, but the Creoles as well. You could kind of say French New Orleans high society really kind of died when the French Opera House burned down in 1919, I believe it was. But New Orleans to this day still has an aristocracy. People who are descended from the original French colonists, and people who are descended from wealthy Americans who came early on in the city's history. There's different groups, different societies, and also you have the Cordon Bleu, who are mixed Creoles, but they are like Passe Blanc. They're very wealthy and they hold on to their name, very prestigious. You have different enclaves of high society in New Orleans. New Orleans never reached the level of wealth that New York reached, like the Vanderbilts and the Astors, because New York City had a lot of money, a lot of very amazing families who rose to immense wealth. But New Orleans, you can kind of say that after slavery and the plantation, the system of the slavery, that Louisiana never really had a firm aristocracy as it did before the Civil War. So yeah, I hope I did a great explanation. I was kind of babbling on, but if you guys want books and sources, I'll be more than happy to share with you.